Welcome to Lord Nightmare channel. We share scary stories with rainy ambience. I hope this video helps you in some way to sleep, relax, or just be entertained for a while. If you enjoy it, please think about subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button to help my channel out. Now let's begin.
It was a few years back, when I was around 14, and my family always went to my aunt and uncle's house for Thanksgiving. They lived about 20 minutes away in a rural part of the countryside. The house was huge, surrounded by acres of land, with a thick line of trees cutting off the view of the next house. Every year, the holiday was filled with laughter, cooking, and lots of family chatter, and this year was no different. The sun was starting to dip when we arrived, casting a golden hue across the yard. I remember the crisp air and how the smell of roasting turkey filled the house. They had a dog, a big golden retriever named Max, who always made me feel at home. I didn't have a dog of my own, and I loved taking Max outside to play or just sit and watch the world go by. So, after a few hours of mingling, I saw Max standing by the front door, his tail wagging, looking up at me. "Let me take him out," I said to my uncle, who nodded in agreement. He reminded me that Max wore a special collar with a shock feature, part of an invisible fence that kept him from running off the property. I grabbed the leash and stepped outside with Max, the cool air biting at my cheeks as we made our way down the long gravel driveway. As I walked, I realized just how isolated it was out there. The trees in the distance seemed to stretch on forever, and the neighbors' houses were barely visible, swallowed by the thick woods between them. Max sniffed the ground, and I felt a strange sense of calm despite the solitude. That's when I saw him, a man walking down the road, moving in a slow, deliberate manner. It felt off right away. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this time, especially since there were no sidewalks, just thick brush and fields. He was stocky, with a grizzled beard, and he wore a tattered blue jacket, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen a wash in weeks. The man noticed me, and with an unsettling grin, he started walking up the driveway toward me. My heart skipped a beat. It was so quiet, and the way he approached was almost too calm. "Hey there," he said, his voice low, like he knew something I didn't. I stiffened and said, yeah, we're just visiting for Thanksgiving." The man smiled wider, then pointed off in the distance where the trees blocked the view. "I'm your neighbor," he said. "I live just next door. I recently borrowed some tools from your uncle, a wheelbarrow and a few things. Could you help me grab them from the garage?" I hesitated. My uncle had never mentioned any neighbors close by, and the way this guy was looking at me was off. But I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded, agreeing to help. "Sure," I said. But then I paused, looking down at Max. "I need to take him inside first." The man's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I can take him from you. You just grab the tools?" I glanced at the dog, then at the electric fence that kept Max within the property's boundaries. There was no way I could just let him run loose. "I'll be right back," I said, and hurried toward the house with Max. When I told my uncle about the man, he looked confused. "Which neighbor?" he asked. I pointed in the direction the man had gone, but when I described him, my uncle's face turned pale. "We don't have a neighbor there," he said, his voice tight with confusion. "The people who live there are out of town for Thanksgiving, and I haven't lent any tools to anyone." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Why would this man lie? My uncle, now visibly unsettled, told me to stay inside while he checked it out. I stood by the door, feeling like something was wrong, when I heard him call for me to come out. We walked down the driveway together, and by the time we reached the road, the man was gone. The street was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. We decided to walk down the road toward the house where the man had claimed to live. My uncle knew the people who lived there, and they had told him they were leaving for the holiday. As we reached the end of their driveway, I noticed that the garage door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. My uncle walked up cautiously and called out. No response. "Hello? Anyone home?" he shouted, but there was nothing. No movement inside, just a faint smell of something metallic in the air. He came back to me with a worried look on his face. "Some of the stuff in there is out of place. And the door, it looks like it's been forced open." We walked back to the house, and my uncle immediately called the police. They arrived within minutes and confirmed what we already feared. The garage door had been pried open, and things were a mess, though there was no sign of the man. We never saw him again that night. The police stayed around for a while, investigating, but the mystery of the man who claimed to be a neighbor was never solved. Looking back, I know I made the right choice not going with him. I can't shake the feeling that something far worse could have happened if I had. Whatever his intentions were, I'm glad my uncle acted quickly. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the trees outside. I never went out again without telling someone, and to this day, I still wonder who that man was, and if he's still out there. It was my first year in college, and Thanksgiving found me alone in my dorm. Most of the students had left for the holiday, heading home to their families. I, however, was stuck on campus. Being an international student, I couldn't afford to fly home for just a few days. I hadn't made close enough friends to be invited to anyone's Thanksgiving dinner, so I spent the day in my dorm room, the silence of the empty building growing heavier by the hour. I had considered ordering takeout, but the loneliness of the holiday weighed on me. I needed to get out of my room. I decided to walk to a small Chinese restaurant a few blocks away. It was one of the few places open for the holiday. The cold air hit me like a wave as I stepped outside, and I made my way down the deserted streets, the crunch of snow beneath my boots the only sound around. The restaurant was warm, and the food was better than I expected. I stayed there longer than I planned, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the stillness of the evening. After finishing my meal, I lingered for a while, not ready to return to the emptiness of the dorm. But eventually I left, stepping back out into the cold. The walk back was quieter than usual. Most students were gone, and the campus felt like a ghost town. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground. That's when I noticed him, a man standing by the entrance of a nearby building, just watching me. At first, I thought he was just another student, but something about him made my stomach twist. His eyes never left me as I walked past, and I quickened my pace. When I turned the corner toward my dorm, I saw him again. He was closer now, his footsteps soft in the snow, following me at a distance. I couldn't explain why, but my nerves were on edge. I was a few blocks from campus now, but the empty streets made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I reached my dorm and quickly headed inside, glancing over my shoulder. The man had stopped at the entrance of the building across the street, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows. I rushed inside, locked the door behind me, and bolted the deadbolt, not feeling safe until I had put several layers of security between us. I stayed in my room, trying to study, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Hours passed, and around midnight, I heard something faint, the doorknob rattling. I held my breath, listening intently. Then a knock. It was soft, deliberate, like he was trying to be quiet, not wanting to draw attention. My heart raced. I cautiously approached the peephole and nearly screamed when I saw him standing there. The same man who had been following me from the restaurant. His eyes were wide, staring directly into the door. He must have somehow found his way into the building. My first instinct was to call campus security, but I didn't dare move. If he was still outside, I didn't want to make a sound. I remained as still as possible, trying to control my breathing, hoping he would leave. The knocking stopped after what felt like forever, but I couldn't tell if he had gone. I waited for several minutes before I dared to check again. There was no one in sight. I hesitated, but then decided to call campus security, explaining that I thought a man had entered the building and was lurking around. They assured me they would check it out. Hours later, I heard commotion down the hall, and my curiosity got the better of me. I quietly stepped out of my room, keeping to the shadows. Campus security had already detained the man. 2 officers were wrestling him to the ground near a student's door, the student standing in the doorway, his face bloody but otherwise unharmed. I stayed back, watching from a distance as one of the officers explained what had happened. The man had been trying doors, knocking on them, and when he found one open, he entered and attacked the student. Thankfully, security had arrived in time to stop it from getting worse. I went back to my room in a daze, the events still sinking in. I called my family to let them know I was okay, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's face. He had been following me for longer than I knew. I couldn't help but wonder if I had been his first target or if there had been others. But the most unsettling thought was the note I found later that night, tucked under my door, written in a shaky hand. Next time, I'll be waiting inside. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were headed to my parents' house for Thanksgiving, a tradition we always look forward to. My parents live just 15 minutes away, in a nice, quiet neighborhood tucked away from the city. The drive was always relaxing, especially in the late morning when the sun was still bright and the air crisp. It was a perfect day for a family gathering. As we made our way along the winding back roads, we talked about everything: how the turkey would taste, the relatives we hadn't seen in a while. Everything seemed normal. But when we were just a few minutes from my parents' house, something strange happened that I'll never forget. We were driving past a thick, dark wooded area on the right side of the road when I noticed a figure emerge from the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was a man. He stepped onto the road, standing there like he was waiting for something. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one else around, and it was unusual for anyone to be out here. He wasn't waving or signaling for help at first, just staring at us. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. As we got closer, the man raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave, his eyes locked on us. I glanced at my wife, who immediately tensed up. "Don't let him in, whatever he says," she whispered, her voice low but firm. I rolled down the window, despite every instinct telling me not to. The man approached slowly, his face pale and unshaven, his clothes a bit too ragged for someone on a normal walk. "Hi," he greeted us, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Can you give me a ride to the gas station? It's just a little ways back down the road." I glanced at my wife again, her eyes wide with unease. I told the man I couldn't help him, and asked if he had a phone or needed someone to call for him. He declined both offers, his expression remaining eerily blank. Something about him didn't sit right. I politely told him again that I couldn't give him a ride, and then started to drive off, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly avoided something bad. We made it to my parents' house without incident and tried to shake off the weird encounter. The family started arriving, and the holiday cheer filled the air. I even asked a few relatives if they had seen the man on the road, but they all just looked at me like I was crazy. Nobody had seen him. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, I found myself standing near the front window in my parents' living room, chatting with some family members. That's when I saw him again, just down the street, walking slowly like he didn't have a care in the world. It was him, the same man. He was walking at a snail's pace, his head tilted like he was looking for something or someone. But there was no one else out. Just him, aimlessly wandering the street, lost or maybe searching. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner, and then I pushed the thought out of my mind, distracted by the sounds of laughter from the kitchen. But as night fell and the house filled with the warm glow of candles, we heard a knock at the door. At first, it was soft, almost like a tap. Then a little harder. We all exchanged glances, confused. Everyone who had been invited was already inside. Who could it be? Someone cautiously walked over to the door and peeked through the peephole. They stepped back and whispered that there was a man outside. I froze. The description matched. It was him, the same man from the road. I told my parents not to open the door. "Don't let him in, it's the same guy who asked for a ride earlier," I said, my voice shaking. We all crowded around the window, watching him standing there, just staring at the door. He wasn't knocking anymore, just waiting. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and started walking away. But instead of heading back down the street, he walked towards the side of the house, toward the backyard. My uncle, who was the first to notice, opened the door just enough to yell at him. "What are you doing back there?" my uncle shouted, his voice sharp. The man froze, his back to us. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted, running down the street so fast it was like he was being chased, his feet pounding the pavement. He disappeared into the darkness, and for the rest of the night, we never saw him again. We never found out who that man was, or what he wanted. All we knew was that he was not just some lost traveler or someone in need of help. Whatever his intentions were, they weren't good. I haven't driven down that road since. The whole encounter still haunts me, especially knowing that man had been watching us the entire evening, probably waiting for an opportunity. Who knows what could have happened if we had let our guard down? This happened to my friend Sarah and I on Thanksgiving night, and I've never been able to forget it. It was about 4 years ago, and I was a sophomore in high school. After the big Thanksgiving dinner and watching the football game, we decided to take our usual walk around the neighborhood. It was a tradition we had every year, but that night was different. Something was off, and we didn't even realize it until it was too late. It was around 11:30 p.m., and everything in our small town was unusually quiet for a holiday night. There were about 12,000 people living here, so the streets were typically calm, even late at night. The houses we passed were all lit up with Thanksgiving decorations, orange pumpkins, glowing lights, and people's windows fogged up from the warmth inside. It felt like the kind of peaceful night where nothing could go wrong. But as we walked, I started to notice the stillness around us. The silence was unsettling. No cars, no dogs barking, just the sound of our shoes crunching on the cold, dry leaves beneath us. The neighborhood felt almost too quiet. We were walking down Maple Street, our usual route, when a white van slowly passed by. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another car, right? But then the van turned around at the end of the street, way slower than it should have. Sarah and I exchanged a quick glance, and a chill ran down my spine. Something about that van felt wrong. It started driving back toward us, and instead of just passing by, it slowed to a stop. The headlights illuminated the sidewalk ahead of us, casting long, eerie shadows. The window on the driver's side rolled down, but the man inside didn't say a word. He just stared, this long, cold, empty stare. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on us. The air felt thick, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like we were trapped in some twisted movie scene. Sarah and I both kept walking, but our pace quickened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The van didn't leave. It just sat there. My stomach twisted. What was he waiting for? And then, out of nowhere, the van started moving in reverse, slowly at first, but then faster and faster, racing back down the street toward us. We both froze. Panic hit me like a wave. Before I could say anything, Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the woods on the left side of the street. We ran, not looking back. We dove into the trees, the branches scratching at our arms, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot louder than our heavy breathing. We'd only gone about 15 feet when I heard the van screech to a halt. The engine was still running. I could hear it clearly even from the woods. My eyes were wide, trying to adjust to the dim light. Then, the door creaked open. We froze. I could see the outline of a man step out of the van, but the darkness made it impossible to make out his features. He stood there for a moment, scanning the street. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Was he looking for us? Was he expecting us to run? For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, staring into the woods like he knew we were hiding, but he couldn't see us. I held my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Finally, after what felt like ages, he turned and got back into the van. I heard the tires screech as it backed up and disappeared down the street. But I didn't move. Not yet. I waited, listening for any sound that would tell me it was safe to come out. Sarah whispered, "Is he gone?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure. We waited for a few minutes in the thick, cold underbrush, hearts racing. I could barely hear anything but my own breathing. We waited longer than we probably should have. And then, when it seemed quiet enough, we carefully made our way out of the woods and slipped between houses, staying as far away from the street as we could. We took the long way back to Sarah's house, cutting through backyards and staying in the shadows. When we finally got back inside, my heart didn't stop racing. What had that man wanted? Why had he followed us, stopped, and then just left? I still have no answers. It was Thanksgiving night, the one time of year when you're supposed to feel safe, surrounded by family and warmth. But that night, something in the air felt different. The quiet, the shadows, the unknown man in the van. It all felt wrong. Sarah and I still go on our walks, but we're a lot more cautious now. We never take the same route at night, and we always stay alert. After that night, I started carrying pepper spray in my bag, and I never walk alone. Have you ever had an experience where you felt like something was lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike? Or maybe you've had a strange encounter, like the one we had, where you weren't sure whether to run or confront it. Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you've ever had a Thanksgiving night turn into a real-life horror story, don't forget to share this video with your friends. Stay safe out there and trust your instincts, because sometimes they're all you've got.